Everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is my first time using this software. My name is Mike Moffat, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation here at Smart Prosperity. So I wanted to walk you through our latest reports called Construction and Carbon, the Impact of Climate Policy on Building in Canada in 2025. So, simple question that we investigated was how will the carbon taxation impact the construction industry? So, the genesis of this project was that Canada's Building Trades Union, the CBTU, contacted me, and they basically said, "Look, Mike, we believe that absolutely governments need to deal with the issue of climate change." But our members have concerns about what carbon pricing, both at the federal and provincial level, will mean for their members. What will it mean for their jobs? What will it mean for the industry, and so on? So they asked us to tell them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Sort of model what higher carbon prices will mean for their members' future. So we issued a report. It was released a couple of weeks ago. You can find it on our website, and it's gotten pretty good traction. We've done a lot of media interviews about it. Environment Canada has tweeted it out, both from their account and the minister's account. So it's gotten a fair bit of attention. And today, I'll sort of walk you through what we did and some of the major results. So we decided to look at the year 2025. We thought that would be an interesting point in time because it's far enough along that it allows companies and individuals to make investments and change their behavior in response to higher carbon pricing. So we didn't want to look a year or two down the road because we felt that wouldn't be enough time for people to really make those important investments. And we didn't want to look too far down the line, like say 2030 or farther, because our viewpoint was that, by 2025, governments themselves will have a good idea how this is working, and then we'll sort of tweak their plans accordingly. So we felt 2025, was somewhat arbitrary, but we felt it would be a useful midpoint to look at what happens. So we looked at three different components. We basically go, okay, what happens to the economy overall? What happens to GDP? What happens to the size of different sectors? Obviously, with a focus on the construction sector, but we wanted to look at other sectors as well. Secondly, was just jobs, because that's what their members care about most, and I think it's actually what Canadians think about most when they think about the economic effects of carbon pricing. It hits them where they live. They want to know, okay, is this going to affect my job in a good way or a bad way? Is my job going to be at risk, or in fact, is there going to be more demand for people with my skill set? And then finally, look at investment. We wanted to have an idea of how people were changing their investment, and here I mean investment in physical goods, right, or machinery, equipment, buildings, that kind of thing, not financial investments. So that's what we basically modeled. And again, this is in a Canada where federal and provincial governments rely on carbon pricing to meet their Paris Agreement commitments. So here's how we went about answering that question. So we use this model called gTech from Navius Research. There's some details in the report. You can go to Navius's website, and it gives you kinds of details how this works, but it's basically one of these big econometric models of the Canadian economy that allows you to tweak different parameters. So what we did was we mapped out two scenarios for 2025 and then compared them to 2015 being our base year. So our first scenario was one where we basically left carbon pricing as is. So we didn't remove existing carbon prices, but we basically said the world is not, the world of 2018 is not going to change, right? So, BC's carbon prices are what they are, and they're just going to stay that way. So because we need to use something as the base case, and in my view, it didn't make sense to use as a base case to start removing a bunch of existing policies like BC's carbon tax that have existed for a year. So that's not really what we were worried about. We weren't worried about the effect of existing policies, but rather, or their members, the CBTU members, weren't really worried about existing policies. What they were worried about was a scenario where carbon prices keep going up and up and up. And as they would say, gas prices, gasoline prices go up and up and up and up. What is that going to mean for them? So that was our base case. Our case that, what we actually care about, we call the aggressive case. So it's basically one of rising carbon prices. So think of Spinal Tap, where they turn all the dials up to 11 on the guitar amp. We basically did the same thing. Now this is over time. This isn't sort of an immediate shock, but every single year between 2018 and 2030, all existing carbon prices were increased, and we just tweaked that model so that once we hit 2030, that we hit the Paris commitments, the 30% reduction in emissions targets or emissions. We actually hit that just based on carbon pricing alone. So no other policy changes. So this is 100% reliant on carbon pricing. I would say that that's probably not necessarily a realistic scenario, but what these guys were worried about is sort of, the most extreme scenario. It's sort of, okay, if everything is based on carbon pricing and carbon pricing is what we're worried about, how bad could this get for us? And that's what we kept hearing over and over. That's what they were interested in. Okay, so move on. So what we did first, we need a base case, and our base case was 2015. And to make sure we were comparing apples to apples, we put everything in $2025, right? So we basically sort of accounted for inflation. So all the measures here are, any changes in real dollars that we've already accounted for inflation. These numbers are going to seem a little big to you, like baseline numbers, because they're in $2025, and because inflation is basically going up 2% a year. $2025 are worth about 30% less than $2015. So in $2025, Canadian GDP was about $2.35 trillion, of which the construction industry made up about $173 billion. Right, again, so in reality, in 2015 dollars, that would be about 2 trillion. We account for inflation, say okay, $2025, $2.3 trillion economy. So we can fast forward. If we do that, you'll see that basically every single sector of the economy is growing. And this is the base case. So, no escalating carbon prices. Every sector of the economy has grown. The economy itself has grown by actually more than $500 million. Again, this is in real terms. Some industries like services are growing at a faster rate. Utilities are growing a little bit slower, and so on. But basically, every sector of the economy is growing in the base case relative to 2015. Now let's examine the aggressive carbon pricing case. So here's where we are under aggressive carbon pricing. You'll note, once again, the economy grows by over $500 billion relative to the base case. Now, it is $3 billion smaller. So basically, instead of growing by about 530 billion, it grows by about 527. So carbon pricing does cause the economy to grow a tiny bit slower than it otherwise would. And this is similar to what we've seen in actual carbon pricing studies of actual past carbon prices before. Basically, the economy grows at essentially the same rate, maybe a tiny bit slower here, like 0.1% slower than it otherwise would have, but it still grows. And once again, every sector is larger than it was in 2015, right? So every sector is still growing based relative to the 2015 baseline. But there are some real differences between the base case and the aggressive case. The services do quite well. They tend to be, things like tourism and that kind of thing, which uh, tend to have very low carbon footprints, do really well under carbon pricing regimes because they're not paying a whole lot of carbon pricing, and you're seeing a shift toward some of their activities. Manufacturing does well here. The manufacturing goes up by about 2.6 billion in response to carbon pricing. Utilities goes up a little bit, but there are two sectors that don't do all that well. So you do see a decline in the transportation sector, which makes sense because they have one of the higher sort of carbon footprints. Same with resources. So this is not just oil and gas, but things like forestry and mining. You see this sector is about 3% smaller under the aggressive case than the base case. So although the economy doesn't change a whole lot, the sort of the size of the pie, the distribution of the pie does. And again, this is similar to what we've seen in studies of existing carbon prices. So if you go to the Smart Prosperity Institute website, we have a working paper on the history of British Columbia's carbon price. And this is essentially what we've seen, that British Columbia, the size of the economy stayed, relative to what it would have been without the carbon price. Really, there's not a whole lot of difference, a whole lot of difference in the size of the economy in the two cases, but there are big distributional effects. You see shifts from, some sectors of the economy do well, other sectors of the economy don't do so well. And to be frank, this is what the construction industry was worried about, that they were worried that they would be one of the sectors that got hit pretty hard by this, because as you can imagine, they have to drive to job sites, right? So they do use some gasoline. They were worried that carbon pricing would reduce investment, just reduce the number of jobs. They were worried about carbon leakage, that basically investment would go into jurisdictions that didn't have carbon pricing, so they would lose those jobs to other countries. In fact, as we see, the construction industry was actually, from the perspective of GDP, was one of the big beneficiaries. The sector is 2.5 billion times larger with aggressive carbon pricing than without. So they actually, it's 1%, but on a pretty big base. So again, that's like 2.5 billion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's more jobs, right? That just because the sector is bigger, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are more jobs, because there are a few things that can happen. As the sector grows, it could become more or less productive, right? So a sector could grow, but it could grow through sort of automation, right? In response to the carbon price, they really sort of automate, which is great for productivity, but it could actually cause a job decline. So it's not enough, since these guys are worried mostly about employment effects, it's not enough simply to look at GDP effects. You really have to dig in and model employment as well. So let's go ahead and do that. 2015 base case, at the time we had about 18 million Canadians working, and 1.2 million of those were in the construction industry. This is using, the sort of of these industries. If you use slightly different, definitions, you're going to get slightly different numbers. But this is, one way of looking at it. Again, in 2025, the number of Canadians who are working goes up by about 2 million, and it goes up in every sector, but again, not proportionally, right? So the vast majority of those job gains are in the services sector, which makes sense because you think of everything from engineering to coding to does all those sort of STEM jobs, tourism. That seems to be where things are going. Doesn't rise as much in, say, utilities, but overall, sort of across the board, you're seeing rises in every single category. Now let's look at the aggressive case. Aggressive case, again, you have an increase in about an additional 2 million Canadians working. You get increases relative to 2015 in every single sector except utilities, which stays flat. In the base case, it gains about 300 jobs. In the aggressive case, it doesn't. I would say that that is a bit of a rounding error. These are all point estimates, so there's naturally going to be some statistical error here. But overall, everything, you still get an extra 2 million jobs in every sector, again, except utilities is still gaining jobs relative to the baseline. And in construction, you're still gaining about an extra 150,000 jobs. But if we compare the two, here it's a bit different. So here, in terms of employment, we're actually up, right? So we were down in GDP, but we're actually up in employment. So it actually has some productivity effects. We become slightly less productive overall with carbon pricing. Not a lot. I mean, it's almost a rounding error, but there is a bit of a productivity hit. And we can actually see that when we look at the manufacturing numbers. So remember, and it can work, it can work different ways in different industries. So in manufacturing, it's actually just the opposite. In manufacturing, GDP goes up. The sector gains about $2 billion in output, but actually loses 6,300 jobs. Because in response to carbon pricing, manufacturers get rid of old equipment, get new equipment, and that helps them be more productive, but it actually reduces job growth in the sector. Again, and I can't stress this enough, the sector, employment in the manufacturing sector is still growing and growing significantly from 2015. It's just a little bit smaller than it would have been without carbon pricing. But overall, we see basically an extra 40,000 people working across Canada, and the construction industry is a beneficiary of it. So of that 40,000, about half of those net new jobs, 19,000, are in construction. So this is kind of interesting because, again, their members were a little bit worried that this might harm jobs, but in fact, we found just the opposite. That in fact, the construction sector is one of the big winners in the medium term in both GDP terms and employment terms. And in both cases, it's about a 1% increase relative to the baseline. So the top line results for 2025, higher carbon prices, if enacted, will create an extra 19,000 jobs and $2.5 billion in economic activity for the construction. That's your sort of headline results. And literally that has been a headline in a few of the news articles that have come out. Okay, but what's causing this? And I think more importantly to their members, where are these new jobs? It turns out in percentage terms, they're actually not where you think they would be. And actually they weren't where I guessed they would be. My thought would be that economies that just naturally are lower carbon would do better, that you would see a shift in economic activity and job activity across the country, and central Canada, which tends to be have a lower carbon footprints, would do well, and actually at the expense of Western Canada. Turns out that's not the case, though Ontario and Quebec do quite well as far as construction jobs. The big winner, and this shocked me, if you had given me 5 guesses at the province that would do the best as far as, highest number of construction jobs relative to baseline gain, I would not have guessed Saskatchewan. But in fact, Saskatchewan does, proportionally speaking, in absolute terms, Ontario does the best, but proportionally, Saskatchewan gains the most construction jobs. And in fact, most provinces and territories do gain, but not across the board. So we do see declines in construction jobs, again, relative to baseline, non-relative to 2015, in PEI, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and the territories. Everywhere else sees gains, and the biggest gains, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec. So 3 of the 5 provinces that do the best as far as construction jobs go are in fact in Western Canada. So obvious question here is, what's driving this? And what's driving this is firm and household investments. Now, the numbers here are a little bit boring, so I haven't put them on the slides, but I can walk you through it. So we found, we did some digging and looked at investment. How does the carbon price change investment, in net terms relative baseline? And we found that the businesses and crown corporations increase investment by $12 billion relative to the baseline, relative to the case of non-aggressive, or just the baseline of existing carbon prices. As you would expect, about half of that is in renewable energy, right? So you see solar panels, windmills, wind turbines, you see investments in utility line upgrades, that kind of thing. Makes sense, right? But that's only half of the business investment. So this is not all, this is not all solar panels and windmills and batteries. 4 billion of this go into carbon capture and storage. So that's oil sands, but that's also electricity facilities, other facilities, figuring out ways to capture and store carbon. So that's one of the reasons why Saskatchewan does so well here as far as construction jobs go. First of all, Saskatchewan has a whole lot of coal energy. So that coal becomes cost prohibitive in 2025. So you have to replace it with something. In part, you replace it with renewables, but it can also be replaced with natural gas. You're hearing now in Saskatchewan, they're talking about potentially replacing it with small scale nuclear. There's a lot of options here, but basically what happens is all of these plants become cost prohibitive, so they get replaced. And no matter what they get replaced with, somebody has to build those things. And that somebody is construction workers. Secondly, because of the oil and gas industry in Saskatchewan and Alberta, you start to see a lot of investments in carbon capture and storage. So that's why Saskatchewan does quite well. There are other investments that take place. You get about $3 to $4 billion worth of just new build, so this is new office building, new manufacturing plants, that kind of thing. Because what happens is, if you have particularly inefficient buildings, at some point it just gets cheaper and easier to just basically knock the thing down or just move somewhere else and build new rather than trying to retrofit. So you see a lot of that going on. You see $1 billion, $1 billion to $1.5 billion in installation of energy efficiency. So the water heaters, HVAC systems. So HVAC, sheet metal workers do really well under carbon pricing. So because you get basically both in terms of retrofits, but also in new buildings, you get really efficient heating and cooling systems in these buildings. And again, somebody has to install those, and those are construction workers. and so on. So that's where you see the bulk of investments in a variety of different places. Some that you would expect, like windmills and solar panels, but there's more to it than that. There's also the household sector. So you get $12.5 billion of increased investments from the business sector, but you also see investments, an additional investments of about 5.7 billion in the household sector. Again, these come from two different places. The first is just in housing. So you get not just more new housing, but that new housing gets a little bit more expensive to build. Again, because people focus more on energy efficiency. You can't basically afford to have a drafty house. So you get a lot of sort of new build, but you also get a lot of retrofits and focus on, again, building efficiency and electrification. So, you get people installing new water heaters, more efficient air conditioners, changing from, one type of heat to another type of heat, or one type of cooling to another type of cooling. So you see all of these investments, which makes sense because households realize it's like, oh, I'm really getting dinged on my electrical bills, or I'm getting dinged on my natural gas bills. So I'm going to, the payback period for these investments becomes, 3 to sometimes 1 year. It just makes sense for me to make the capital investment. So, and that's a real theme of this report, that how businesses and individuals respond to carbon pricing is they see their operating costs go up and up and up. Go, okay, well, I can actually save myself a lot of money if I shift, if I find ways to reduce my operating expense by investing in capital expense. And again, if you're involved in that, the installation of that capital expense, you do very well. So again, if we look at the industries, because we can also look at what industries are increasing their investment. It's where you'd expect, utilities and so on. Big one is oil sands. You actually see more investment in the oil sands under carbon pricing. Again, seems a little bit counterintuitive until you realize that what the oil sands are doing is doing a lot of investments in. Here are the figures that I was talking about earlier, that you see investments in renewable electricity, carbon capture and storage. Investment unrelated to energy is largely just new buildings, and that's sort of. And building efficiency and electrification, again, that's investing in new water pumps, air conditioner, HVAC systems. You see, in percentage terms, some of these new investments are absolutely massive changes. So, you're talking about a doubling in investments in efficiency and electrification, a doubling of investment relative to baseline in renewable electricity. Carbon capture and storage goes up tenfold, again, because companies react to the responding increased operating expenses through increased capital expenditure. Go to households, we get $7 billion in investment unrelated to energy. Again, most of that is just new home builds. That's, or at least much of the delta is new home builds. So again, people move out of drafty old houses into new houses, but the new houses they buy, the building costs are a little bit more expensive because they're investing more in energy efficiency to keep those operating costs down. And then an additional about 30% increase relative to baseline in efficiency and electrification. Again, so that's water, water heating and HVAC and so on. So to close, the economic impact of higher carbon pricing is to shift economic activity, which is consistent with the other studies and existing carbon prices. Again, so I would point you to our British Columbia study, which I'm an author of, our British Columbia white paper, which found exactly this. And although, although you do see the shift in economic activity, some sectors gaining, some sectors losing, the construction industry is one of the big net beneficiaries. They do really, really well in the medium term from higher carbon pricing. By about $2.5 billion in GDP and roughly 19,500 jobs. Increased investment in residential construction, carbon capture and storage, commercial construction. So I'll leave it there for any questions. Now I need to try and this navigate this. So see how. My apologies. I'm seeing if I can. There are any questions. I'm not seeing any, but that might just be me not knowing how to use the software. Okay, well, again, I'm not seeing any questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me at any time at m.moffett, m.moffat at smartprosperity.ca, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. I hope you find it useful, and I hope it changes some narratives about carbon pricing. Again, because there are some very real fears in this sector that carbon pricing is going to harm the construction sector, when in fact, it's exactly the opposite. And I think it's important that we, Canadians, whether or not they're in the construction sector, know what higher carbon pricing would mean for them and mean for the economy. So thank you so much for attending today.